Welcome everyone to our ninth meetup of the Entra User Group Germany. This time completely remote. Instead of hybrid from the office, this time we are all in front of our computer screen and joining this event via the Teams call. And we have Spencer Harbar as a guest this time, talking about transitioning to Entra Cloud First Identity Management. But before we go into your session Spencer, first some words about our user groups. So we are the Entra User Group Germany, a community that is focused on identity and access management, especially around Microsoft solutions like the legacy one, Active Directory, and Entra ID, and the other Entra suite features. And our goal is to create an exchange between IAM specialists and newcomers and everybody who's interested about identity and access management to learn the basics and also go into the deep dive areas and participate in the experience, the decades of experience of the experts, of the architects, like Spencer is one. So I'm very happy that we have you in our event today, Spencer.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so generally we do these events hybrid. So we are streaming the event from the Intelity office in Schwabach near Nuremberg, who is our sponsor for the event. So Intelity is providing us with some snacks, with the drinks, and with the hardware and the all the equipment we require to have on-site meetings. So when you are close by, spend us a visit in the Intelity headquarters, and especially when we have our user group meetings, everybody is welcome. Just come by and have a drink and let's talk about identity and access management. So for today, we had a small get-together in the Teams meeting. Now we have 5:05, so the session is about to start. And after Spencer's session, we will have a small discussion and some Q&A. How about questions, Spencer? Should somebody just raise their hand and ask questions, or do you prefer to have the questions in the end?
Yeah, it's probably better to have them at the end. Easier for me, at least. I mean, I don't really mind if I make a mistake, then point it out in the chat. But for questions for this topic, I think probably at the end is practical.
Okay, then we will have an eye on the chat. And in that case, I would say the stage is all yours.
Yeah,
I can see
so
it. Great.
Marvelous. A little bit about me. Thanks very much for Dennis and Ziggy for inviting me. It's actually taken quite a long time to set up. We first mentioned it, I think, a couple of years ago now, but various things got in the way. I'm mostly known for SharePoint in the sort of the public arena, but that's not really what I've spent most of my career doing. I've been mostly in the security/infrastructure space, and particularly with identity management. I've been sort of going in and out of this through the majority of my IT career, at least, and worked on actually the first non-United States version implementation of Zoom It Via, which became Microsoft's Identity Manager product. That was way back in the last century, believe it or not, and followed it all the way through the various implementations, and also done a lot of work with third-party identity management platforms, all the usual suspects from people like Sun, Oracle, etc. Generally, from a sort of consulting perspective, historically, I've been involved in the kind of larger environments, larger customers who tend to have bigger challenges in some cases. At least that's kind of how they frame it, the special companies, shall we say. And of course, for those of you who've done a fair bit of identity management, you'll be aware that actually the challenges they have are basically the same as everyone else. It's just a scale consideration. What tends to be different of note, particularly to this conversation today, is in a multinational company, the conflicts of data ownership and considerations like classification and regulation obviously play an increasingly important role in this space. The place I'm currently working is a good example of that, where we have many different companies, all under one umbrella, and they all operate in different parts of the world. And that does have quite a significant knock-on impact into how identity management is approached from a policy perspective. You can reach me after the event on the email address there. I do reply to every email, but as Ziggy and Dennis will agree, it might take me a little while, but I do eventually reply to all of them. Just put this in here to poke fun at the vendors to start with. A bit of English humor here. We've obviously got the whole industry forcing AI in one form or another down our throats. For the most part, so far in identity management, particularly from Microsoft, we're actually kind of not having it so much. So, I'm not going to really talk about it to any great degree, which may be a relief to many of you. I know I'm getting fed up of told to use it to manage my calendar better and things like that. I'm sure it does a wonderful job, but I'm okay with managing my calendar. Before I start talking about the main topic, which is basically how the industry in general and how Microsoft envisage the moving of identity management capability from on-prem historically to the cloud, just want to touch on a couple of identity management fundamentals. None of the leading vendors really spend much time in this space. They'll kind of shy away from it or assume that the customer organization has got this down. That's understandable, right? Their fundamental reason for existence is to build and sell product. But like with most things in IT, there's a broader practice discipline that underlines, how a piece of software will be used effectively. If we think about configuration change management, that generally is not driven by the product, it's driven by a process, and it's the same thing here, particularly with older corporations. So corporations that have been around since before we had general purpose computing, they tend to have this implemented out with technology. So I'm not going to spend too long on it because I understand many of you are already experienced in this area, but it's important to kind of set the scene here to underline some of the points I make earlier. This is the most important thing from my experience, is particularly an organization that is doing a new initiative of some description, usually under the auspices of wanting to clean up their identity management or get their house in order. Those are the kind of phrases you hear from the customer in the early days. And I did one for a global airline about a decade ago where this was very much the case. The project from start to finish took 2 years. The technical implementation took less than 3 months. The rest of that project was dealing with non-technology considerations. And to emphasize this, these are the areas that I'm talking about. Who owns the data, right? If we have a corporation with a HR department, is it the HR that is responsible for the people data in the organization, or is that delegated across other departments, and so on and so forth? There'll be different gates of control across organizations. If we think about an organization like Airbus, or indeed the Eurofighter holding company, think about that. You've got 4 nation states involved, 4 primary contractors, all of their supplier, parts suppliers, etc., right? There's a lot of barriers between in terms of the data ownership. There's a lot of people to get on board. What's the organizational culture? Again, a project like Tornado or Eurofighter is a classic example where, we made it work, right? But we made it work by a lot of hard work to try and mesh the cultures of these vastly different organizations together. significant language barriers although actually for those two projects it worked out quite well. The previous one, the Sepicat Jaguar with 2 nation states, the language barrier was much more of a problem. For example, which unit of measurement were we going to use for the project, inches or metric? Obviously, the right answer was metric, but back then that was not so simple. So those kind of cultural things really play into identity management as well, because in a lot of cases, you're also dealing with historical systems and data that has happened via acquisition, right? A big companies gobbling up lots of smaller companies. They've all got different systems, different policy implementations, if any policy implementation. A lot of small companies, they don't have the bandwidth to do this stuff well. They certainly don't have the bandwidth to keep it up to date with whatever privacy and other regulations might be being enforced in increasing complexity and frequency. Something that the European Union in particular is much better at than, how do we say it politely, people that chose to leave. So these kind of issues really do impact quite considerably and massively extend the time needed for discovery early days in a project. Any identity management initiative should start with a discovery, right? To uncover what the real requirements should be, rather than just simply taking the requirements that have been given to us by somebody who's probably a little bit optimistic about how long it's going to take and what the end result is going to be. Because as you do the discovery, you start finding new applications, applications that may be run once every 6 months. And the rest of the time, nobody's even really aware that thing exists. It might be running on a server under somebody's desk somewhere or hiding in the corner of a data center. Then we get to the data, right? If we're talking about identity management, one of the key things that we're going to be interested in is the properties of or attributes of users or computers or meeting rooms or whatever, right? And if that data needs to exist, but if it exists, is it clean? Is it up to date? Have we got the right policy to ensure that things like a date of birth, for example, is protected? Particularly the year of birth, right? It might be okay to know that my birthday was 31st of August. It's not so cool for the year to be, exposed to every other person in the organization. How quickly does the data change, right? Think about it. If you work at Microsoft, how often people change jobs at Microsoft, right? Is the directory keeping up with the line manager and all of those kind of things? Then we get a little bit more technical, how good is Active Directory or Entra ID? How many, are they cleaning it up? Is it maintained well? How, is it scalable, etc.? Usually the AD and certainly Entra ID, of course, is generally in good shape, but not always. But the line of business systems that rely on it for critical people processes, what might be implemented in SAP, PeopleSoft, Workday, etc. Quite often those systems are not in place, and it's a very old version of some custom solution, for timesheets or something like that. So, if that's a single server somewhere, or it's a creaky application in general, wherever it's hosted, if we need to implement a process that takes data from AD or Entra and puts it into that business system to synchronize, we need to be aware of, when it's up and when it's being, when it's taken out of service to be backed up or similar, those kind of things. Then also how we are going to authenticate to those systems, right? Identity management generally, in most cases, is not simply a question of just dealing with Active Directory or Entra. We're usually going to be working with other systems. How do we authenticate to them? Have we got the dreaded, username and password in a web config file somewhere on some terrible web application that was, 20 years ago was seen as being the new way of doing things. All of these kind of things tend to get uncovered early days. And then increasingly, although I kind of get, it's a bit lame to say that now because it's really been the case for the last 15 years, the privacy regulation and legislation now that's enforced for the right reasons, but nonetheless is an increasing burden on organizations from a compliance perspective. It's very easy to look at that cynically and say, oh, how incompetent is that company for not putting it in place? And that's partially accurate, but it's also fair to say that that organization existed long before the politicians woke up and realized that we needed regulation for this stuff. So it's not always as straightforward as we might imagine. Also, a couple of other things. Try not to get into the profile data storage business. We're all Entra people, I presume, for the most part, so we're kind of already on board with that. We're letting Microsoft take care of that risk for us. But if somebody comes along and says, well, can't we just put those usernames for that one application in a MySQL database in Amazon? Yeah, the answer's no, we shouldn't be doing that. That's a terrible idea. It's like secure ID key fobs, for any of you that have used those in the past. Those are great, except for when the users get drunk and leave them in the back of the taxi after a night out, and then somebody's got to deal with, killing that one, issuing a replacement, blah, 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 right? So it's a world of pain. And also, if you're working with a corporation, the chances are you're going to run into somebody who owns identity for that corporation. And there tend to be somebody my kind of age, my kind of grumpiness, they're very set in their ways. They're interested in protecting their little fiefdom. And in most cases, somebody coming along and saying, we can do that better in the cloud, et cetera, is going to put them on edge. It's not a quick process to get them on board with a new way of doing things. Also true of consultants as well, of course. It's the age-old sort of IT joke, right? You put 10 architects in the room and ask them for an opinion, you'll get 25 opinions. This slide is mostly for Americans to poke fun at them. We're very good at this in Europe, and particularly in Germany and Switzerland and Austria. We're very good at it, but other places, not so good. Expect that the plan is the plan and shall never change. And that's not how this works, because we will, as good as we can be on discovery, we will always find other things as we get deeper into the weeds. Things always come up, and that's truer of cloud than any other delivery platform I've seen so far. Okay, so that sort of preamble out of the way, I also want to cover a little bit on how identity management is done now, effectively, before the move to the cloud or before the transition to the cloud. It's worth pointing out the importance of this chap, sadly no longer with us. He's the inventor of Zoomit Via, which is the first and only state-based meta directory. This is a really important concept to understand, hence why I've included a few slides here on what that means for us. And it's interesting because the identity community in general is kind of sort of dismissing this individual's impact on the industry and said, oh, well, he's kind of yesterday's guy. He was the AD guy, it doesn't really matter so much. We've moved on. Well, the interesting thing is, that's not really true at all. If you go back and read the 7 laws of identity, actually all of the things that all the key vendors are now hyping and selling as an approach to addressing the problems of an interconnected cloud solutions really all boil down to those laws. It's a bit like the PowerShell manifesto, right? Okay, the terminology and everything in that document are very old-fashioned, but if you think about it and then apply it to how we are managing Azure today using things like Cloud Shell and all the rest of it, it's exactly what that guy was talking about in the PowerShell manifesto, just with a slightly different terminology. So this chap, Canadian chap that then went to work for Microsoft after the acquisition of his company, basically laid the foundation for everything else that we're going to talk about. I'm sure we're all familiar with Identity Manager, the product. What's not so well known is that the synchronization service part of the product, at least, comes from Zoomit via and has gone through the more renames than SharePoint. It's quite amusing. And even today, if we're using Entra Connect, the legacy way to synchronize on-prem AD with Entra ID, we are using a version of this software. It's that state-based meta directory that I was talking about. We will ignore, for the purposes of this, the horrible hacktastic cut-down version that they bundled with SharePoint, because that was dreadful. Anyway, yeah, this is Identity Manager, the suite. Virtually everything has gone away or been replaced with something better in the cloud. The thing we're interested in here is the sync service, the part's in yellow, and this is the foundation of Entra Connect. This is interesting. This is the marketing message before and after the rename of Azure AD to Entra. So the first one, that makes sense to most people in technology world. Actually works well when you translate it into different languages as well. But you can see then, they've made a desperate attempt to make it still relevant in the cloud world by putting in some extra word salad about augmenting cloud hosted services and blah, blah, blah. Just poking fun at that a little bit, really. But it's, important to understand. I'm going to skip this because I have a better diagram, sorry. This is basically how it works. We have two connected systems in this case, an SAP R3 in this example, right, on-prem with its own database that has user identities in it, as does Active Directory on premises. And we have a thing called a connector space, which is a logical representation of the identity information from the connected system, independent of each other. And then we have a thing called the metaverse, which is a combination of those two connector spaces data. And we may do some transformation in there to change, let's say, the telephone number format in SAP does not match what we expect in AD. So we might do some string slinging there to fix that up. So if in most companies, when we join the company as an employee, the first thing that happens is not that our AD account is created or our Entra account is created, right? That's usually not the first onboarding step. Usually it's done through Workday or SAP or one of these type systems. And then as a result of that, an AD account is created. If we're not doing identity management, then there'll be like a service desk ticket raised, and the AD administrator will manually create the account, right? But if we're using identity management, then we've got a system like this that will automatically provision the account into Active Directory. So that's what's happening here in essence. Now, I know this is a very simple example. It's really to underpin the importance that in this particular system example, there's no software needing to be run on Active Directory domain controllers. So there's no agent, and there's no software running on the SAP database or application server. So there's no agents here, and that enabled this in a unique way in the enterprise historically for on-prem, because imagine you're a consultant and you have to try and ask your domain administrator for permission to install an agent on their domain controllers. In most organizations, the answer to that is going to be an immediate no, not allowed. But of course, it's not so fit for purpose in the cloud, right? Because it's not feasible in the cloud to use that approach. Why do we still care? Aside from like the technology background, this still underpins virtually everybody doing it says on the slide identity management on the Microsoft platform, but really it's wider than that. You know, it's everybody that's running Microsoft 365, or what we used to call Office 365. If they're doing identity sync with on-prem AD, then they're using Entra Connect in almost all cases. All of the customers that were doing hybrid early doors, you know, the big corporations whose names I won't use, but let's call them Contoso, Fabricam, and Woodgrove. You all know who I'm talking about. Those people are all using it. You know, it's the source systems that define how we deliver a solution, right? So if we've got PeopleSoft on-prem, we're going to need to approach how we connect to that differently than if we're using Workday in the cloud. Seems really obvious when I say it out loud like that, but it's often overlooked. You know, as I've mentioned, identity manager is not so great for the cloud-based world because these connectors are in themselves, you know, on-prem components, right? That's a server that you've got to deploy and run. Okay, it's going to be in a VM, but you know, it's infrastructure as a service. The customer is responsible for backup, high availability, you know, installing everything. It's full trust code that runs on that server. And really the focus of this whole presentation is knowing that that eventually is going to go away and be replaced. It's how we manage the transition and work through it over time. I haven't come across an enterprise or even a small to mid-market customer that's 100% cloud, unless, you know, they were incorporated in the last 5 years. They're going to have some legacy stuff, right? That's why they can't kill their domain controllers. They probably, you know, if they've had Exchange, then there's another thing there that stops them removing, you know, the last server in the Exchange organization. Line of business systems. You can't just lift and shift this stuff unless the vendor has got a process, you know, for that and is willing to support it. There's also, you know, it has to be said, particularly in the UK, I know it's also the case in other parts of Europe in particular, where the old way is still deemed entirely acceptable. Indeed, in finance, there are many organizations who have, you know, as part of their strategy have said, we are not moving these systems in this bucket to the cloud yet, you know, for a variety of reasons, some good, some a bit more dubious, but, you know, that is still unfortunately part of the puzzle. Couple of little things on identity manager in general for anybody that's using it. It's really important to be on the current version. I did double check this yesterday to make sure that this is still the so-called current version. It's really old, but basically if you're on the version before it and then you raise a support case, unfortunately they're going to tell you to go away, install this update and come back and then we'll answer your question. Now, that's understandable because they have limited resources, right? They've got to make a decision inside Microsoft. What are we spending our time and money on? Are we building the new stuff or are we supporting the old stuff? So they want you on the version that they are capable of supporting. Generally, that would have been a recommended practice anyway, you know, always be on the latest build. It wasn't like MIM were chucking them out every 2 months like certain other products. They were very good with their updates, but nonetheless, you know, once you put MIM in, it's the sort of thing that people are very nervous about touching or making a change to in any way. So it's not unusual that you might be behind on the version. The support statement at present is that support ends in 2029. Now, I didn't update this slide, admittedly. I said here, I suspect this may be further extended. I'll revisit that verbally and say I know it's going to be extended because of the recent announcements regarding the Azure private cloud for sovereign customers, where the support for the legacy on-prem products like Exchange, Subscription Edition, SharePoint, etc., and Windows Server have also been extended to 2035. What is important is the Azure AD connector, which is the .NET solution that you install in MIM to speak to what used to be called Azure AD, which many customers were using prior to the rebrand of Entra ID Connect, is deprecated. So that is something to move away from. Now that is important because that then means that you have your MIM infrastructure, right, which is at least two, well, it should be 4 servers, bare minimum, 2 for MIM, 2 for SQL Server. You need additional infrastructure to run Entra ID Connect because Entra Connect cannot run on the same machine as MIM. So just bear that in mind. Okay, so let's now change gear. I'm going to poke fun at them again. You know, they did this rename and made a big fuss about it, and then, you know, didn't do a very good job of actually doing the rename themselves. But this is really difficult because you know, you're going to be going into customers and they still call it Azure AD, right? I mean, it's just a given. It's going to be very difficult. And in a lot of cases, you know, organizations have got naming conventions for objects, and you know, you might be talking about something trivial like an application registration in Entra, right, which has got a naming convention which starts with Azure AD or AAD. So this is important because the non-technical people involved in the project, you know, project managers and other stakeholders can easily get like just completely confused by the naming. And to be fair, I won't even just limit it to them. You know, sometimes I'm getting muddled up with all these names. So yeah, Entra Connect, what used to be called Azure AD Connect, is basically just the new name for the old stuff, which, as you can see in the screenshot, is FIM, right? Is MIM. It's the same stuff. It's just got a different logo there, and you can see they even call it Azure AD themselves in their own product. I think that's actually now been updated, but when I made this screenshot approximately 7 or 8 months ago, that was, you know, that was what it was displaying. So yeah, it basically is a cut down version of MIM, which is pre-configured, and as you know, it syncs your on-prem AD with Entra ID. It's designed as an appliance. You set it up once, you go through the wizard, you give it a global administrator permission. It doesn't run as the global admin, but it needs it to set up the initial configuration. And then it just runs, and you can view its success or failure within the Entra portal, and of course the event log on the server itself. It uses the traditional architecture. We also have a thing called Entra Cloud Sync, which is the new name for Azure AD Cloud Sync. Obviously, this is the new approach. So instead of using an agent, instead of using connectors, it uses agents that are on the connected system. So it's interesting, isn't it, that the cycle has gone from, we used to use agents for everything, then we went to state-based, and now we've basically gone back in a cycle to using agents. So this is good. This is better than Entra Connect because we're not responsible as the customer for hosting the infrastructure that runs the cloud sync stuff, right? When we can get rid of those 2 identity manager machines, we can get rid of the SQL Server database, and that's now being done by Microsoft, and we can beat them up if it goes offline, and you know, we've got an SLA and all the rest of it, all the traditional benefits of software as a service. It also allows us to leverage Entra ID security controls. This is not such a big deal now because Entra ID has become extremely mature in terms of offering support for additional factor authentication and self-service password reset and all the rest of it. But historically, you know, these things were coming online over time. You know, we didn't have them originally, and it's improved over time. And by using this approach, whatever they implement as new improved security controls in Entra ID, we don't have to change our sync strategy to be able to take advantage of them. So that will become, will continue to be important over time. Yeah, it reduces the on-premises footprint effectively to just one agent on each connected system. Now, there is a slight caveat to that. I haven't updated this screenshot because the important thing on this slide is actually the hyperlink. Obviously, the table is much longer than what I can fit on a slide, but this web page is updated frequently and it compares the two. So we can, as we go through our discovery process on a project, we can say, okay, we've got our various requirements. Quick check here, does Cloud Sync now support device objects? If yes, then we can use it in combination with things like Intune. Now, if it doesn't, in the timeline of when I created this slide, then obviously that means that we can't move to Cloud Sync until it does, right? We need to stay with Connect. So this is, fundamentally important document that kind of gets buried a bit inside the Microsoft Learn, hierarchy. Always try and be relatively up to date with what this document says. So yeah, the Entra Cloud Sync will eventually be the sort of be all and end all for this, but it is relatively early days and is mostly at the moment targeted towards, the removal or the reduction of Active Directory on premises. It's clear that in the future we will have a much broader and wider cloud-based identity management solution for heterogeneous environments in the Microsoft platform. Unfortunately, that's about as far as I can go, but it doesn't take too much of a crystal ball to see what they've done with things like Purview, Defender, etc., to see what's coming down the road in this space. This transition is going to take, it says on the slide, could take a decade. I mean, some of my customers are still running Lotus Notes. So, really that should say could take decades, plural, but anyway, you get the idea. It's also taken time for the marketplace to match the extensibility that's possible with Identity Manager. So at the moment for Identity Manager, there's about 700 connectors for a variety of different systems. And, there's an SDK, right? You could, if you want to, if you're crazy, you can fire up Visual Studio and you can code up a connector for your product that you sell, that you build and sell. And over time, it's going to take time for there to be a similar number of agents, for cloud synchronization. But you can see the sort of how to say it, the flow of travel over time. Also bear in mind, a lot of enterprises will also have third-party identity management solutions in place, right? There's a lot of companies out there offering what they consider to be superior cross-platform solutions in this space. And the bigger the company, the more likely that one of these is in play, either because when they made the purchase decision, they believed that they were better than the Microsoft offering, or indeed they were just anti-Microsoft, right? That's the thing we have to deal with. There's a lot of companies historically have a barrier or a hurdle to overcome in terms of their trust in this space. And some companies have policies that dictate you shouldn't have all your eggs in one basket with one vendor. And that's increasingly becoming a concern now, that has been extended to say you shouldn't have all your eggs in one basket with vendors from a particular nation state. Now that's a problem because as the two examples on this slide are also from the same nation, but nonetheless, people are starting to talk about that stuff And it's not to debate whether that's a rational conversation or not, but it is a conversation that's happening. Okay, so how do we move in the right direction? It's helpful to start with some goals. Really, this is all about, as Siggy said right at the top of the call, is to reduce our dependency on what people call legacy platforms. I don't like that phrase really, because it's legacy has an aura of basically saying something isn't very good. But actually, Active Directory served us pretty well for the last 25 years, and I would hazard a guess that many of us here would not be in this business if it wasn't for that product. So, but nonetheless, if we use the term correctly, and I'm English, so I get finicky about these things, they are obviously legacy. And in our world, that basically means, most importantly, Active Directory, but it's also MIM, because if you are running MIM and you're doing it on a relatively large scale, it's very expensive. You've got a lot of servers, you've got SQL to worry about. It's a big deal. And we also want to understand that the reason for doing it, or some of the reasons for doing it, is not capital cost, right? It's not capital expenditure. It's also to be part of the move towards using more appropriate modern authentication mechanisms, right? We want to be able to leverage the innovation in the identity space, which is related to user sign-on, and be able to open up access to applications using, OAuth, basically, in a nutshell, but also leverage, passwordless approaches and so on. We cannot predict with any great deal of confidence when new authentication protocols are going to come. What we can say with confidence is that they will come, right? Just as NTLM and Kerberos have been effectively, punted, the same will be true of some of what is now considered to be a more modern way of doing it. We really need a target cloud-based architecture for the next few years, and when by few years I'm meaning up to 5 years here. Now this is more broad strategic from the organization, not just identity focused. We need to know, well, okay, what are we going to use for HR platform in this organization over the next 5 years? Those kind of things. Clear needs to be made clear to everybody. This is not one of these projects where we're going to do 8 months of work and then we're going to turn off the old one and turn on the new one and everything's solved, right? This is not a revolution. The trouble with revolutions is, they usually result in, catastrophic destruction and individual removal, right? So we don't want a revolution in this particular case, because that's, it's destructive. So it's an evolution, it's a journey, to use American sort of marketing terminology. We also, whilst we want to reduce our dependency on legacy platforms, we don't want to have to be in a situation where we're nullifying an existing investment, or we're throwing it away. So we don't, if we've got a 5-year contract for product X to do something, we don't want to be forced to have to end that contract early and effectively lose money because of the identity management project. And we're making an assumption here that Entra ID is going to be the primary directory involved in the environment. So most hybrid scenarios assume that all users have on-premises access and there's some cloud accounts. Again, think about a classic Office 365 deployment when it's hybrid, Exchange, SharePoint, etc. The account is mastered in Active Directory and we synchronize it to the cloud. Whereas the cloud first scenario is basically the reverse of that, right? It's that accounts are mastered and all users have them in the cloud, and only the people that need them have got them on premises. and we want to remove them as much as possible. That's true also for things like service accounts and in a lot of organizations, test accounts and dummy accounts and all the ones that have, been sat there disabled for 3 years because, the person's left the company or whatever. Now, in the interest of time, I'm going to focus on data flow here rather than, all kinds of other things like having fancy workflows for various different onboarding activities and so on. It's not possible to do everything in even a couple of hours. Also important, and this is something that Microsoft actually do quite a good job of stressing, and it comes across as a bit of a sales pitch, but it's really important that if we're doing cloud first identity, we can't sort of silo that and ignore what people are doing with Intune, right? Everything's joined up together. If we're using Defender, Intune, Purview, looking to leverage some third-party authentication mechanism, it's all joined together, and that's really important because that will give us a steer in the right direction. And identity management historically has tended to focus on line of business systems. Now we need to consider, the laptops, the mobile phones, the whole piece. That's good for us as consultants, right? Because we're broadening our exposure to perhaps other technologies, and making us in the end more knowledgeable, more employable, etc. This is like your doctor should tell you, everything's connected, right? If you've got pain in your wrist, it's probably connected to that fall you had 10 years ago that put your disc in your back out and you've been ignoring and hoping goes away. Whereas in reality, the older you get, the more problems it's causing. So the reason for reusing this diagram is the scope of an identity management project when we're talking about cloud first is quite a lot bigger than one that we would have historically done, which focused on line of business systems. Hopefully you don't have DMZs anymore, but the reality is corporations that invested in them back in the early 2000s when they were the industry's preferred approach to doing things, all brought into it hook, line and sinker and spent millions of dollars on investing in them and the infrastructure that is required to run them. So they still exist. But this is just an example slide rather than trying to outline any particular architecture. If you like architecture diagrams, you should definitely check out Roger Sessions, who's got some great diagrams that compare this with the reality of enterprise architecture in the real world, and they mostly resemble toddlers' scrawlings on a napkin in a restaurant, right? Because that tends to be how it actually ends up being. So Microsoft, and importantly, to understand other industry experts, including people like me and other vendors like the Oxford Computer Group, have created these 5 states of transformation, and they generally align up with what the business goals of customers are trying to do. So I'm going to review these and then also compare them to slightly more detailed scenarios, which is where it actually started from, which get into a little bit more technical. The problem with the original ones was they were very optimistic, but they're useful in explaining the concepts here. The fact that Microsoft has basically taken ownership of this is really good because they have the resources to keep them up to date and then also expand them out, linking over to new feature capabilities as they become available. Whereas previously, nobody really had the time to do that. So these are the 5 states. We have cloud attached, hybrid, cloud first, AD minimized, and 100% cloud. So naturally, 100% cloud is kind of like the ideal destination that we want to get to. Cloud attached is the most common reality. Although actually for me, in terms of the types of stuff that I've done recently, hybrid is actually the most common. much more so than cloud attached. But admittedly, I no longer work with small customers. So you can see the kind of, I don't know how to describe these diagrams. They're kind of a hybrid in themselves between what I used to call marketecture, right? It looks good on a whiteboard, kind of a bit confusing. So I'm going to talk through them in a bit more detail. So the first one, cloud attached, this is obviously somebody who's got an Entra tenant. They've probably done that to enable Microsoft 365, Exchange, meaning Exchange and SharePoint, OneDrive. That's operational, working well. They're probably doing a few extra little bits and pieces as well. They've gone beyond that. Maybe they're playing around with Power Apps, Copilot, etc. But they also obviously have an on-prem environment, probably quite extensive. They're maintaining both. They need the skills to maintain both. Devices themselves and the users are mastered in Active Directory. We're using group policy, or what was that product used to be called? The management product. Oh, I can't remember. The old version of Intune, the on-prem version of Intune, whatever that was called, they're using that, or similar. We're synchronizing it to Entra ID through Entra Connect. So the apps are authenticated to AD and maybe via ADFS or a similar approach. They could be maybe using enterprise applications in Entra in place of ADFS, but they're using some SAML to speak to external line of business systems. So that's probably a scenario, a customer you're all very familiar with. Then we have hybrid, and what's the difference between this and the first one? Well, from a sort of categorization perspective, it's the organization that started the process of, not having such a clear delineation between what's cloud and what's on-prem, and trying to sort of move more things into the cloud first type world. So they're growing their expertise in the new suites. This slide doesn't mention Sentinel or Defender. It probably should do, because that's definitely in the mix here. It's common, easy day-to-day IT operations to provision a new laptop, etc. That isn't a challenge for them. You note the note here that it says the client machines are now Entra hybrid joined as opposed to AD, right? So that's the middle ground between being Entra only and Entra hybrid. If a new platform is being deployed, let's say they want a new timesheet system and they've gone to market, they're basically saying to the vendors, it must integrate with Entra ID. Legacy apps are going via a proxy or are in some way moving towards native integration with Entra ID. We're doing self-service password reset. You get the idea. So from what I'm, as I mentioned before, this is really where I'm seeing at least the majority of customers now. Then we have cloud first. This is basically a logical extension where the majority of the time is being spent doing moving workloads to the cloud. And so that's driving, that's the fundamental thing that's driving IT in the organization. New clients are joined to Entra ID, managed through Intune. So they're not doing group policy anymore. They're not doing the product name I can't remember. They're not using third-party products to offer additional, client management facilities for things like USB and so forth. Anything that was doing AD on-prem integration is now doing Entra ID directly, right? So using Azure native capabilities. File and print, somebody somewhere's got a plan to kill that and move that to Azure or Entra ID. Maybe probably using B2B collaboration in Microsoft 365 as well. And this is where most people want to be, right? Or will tell you they are, and then you do a little bit of digging and find out actually they're a bit more closer to number 2 than they are to number 3. Active Directory minimized, which is an interesting term that I didn't think I would see Microsoft use, but nonetheless, they have done. Yeah, this is basically another sort of step towards the nirvana where we're doing virtually everything in Entra ID, but there are some edge cases that continue to use on-prem. That might be, again, the one straggler line of business system that is needed. One of the problems with reducing AD infrastructure is understanding that there's an awful lot of objects in Active Directory, and in many cases, no identified owner or responsible party for them. All right, so again, think about the canonical Contoso, who's a multinational corporation with 200,000 employees. Okay, it's reasonable to assume they have 500,000 objects in that directory to cover off, the computers and the users and a few printers and so on. In reality, you're talking more about 4 million objects, right? When you cover off meeting rooms, projectors, and the gazillion test accounts that have been created over time and so on. So just going ahead and deleting them and saying, oh, well, if anybody complains, then we know that's not going to fly in those type of organizations. So that's one of the other pieces of technical debt that is omnipresent, and the larger the company, the older the company in IT terms, the bigger that problem is. That's the same reason, Lotus Notes won't go away entirely, or SharePoint on premises, will never die entirely because it was too successful, right? I mean, there's just that much of it out there. But nonetheless, even with that in mind, basically everything that's new is being onboarded into the new model, into the cloud first model, leveraging Entra ID for both its service identity and its user identity. If we were doing, a print server, we're now using universal print. If we were doing SQL Server on premises, we're using Azure SQL, etc. Actually, you need to update that slide and tell them to update the document because we've got a new name for virtual desktop. And then the nirvana, I don't want to spend too long on this. This is 100% cloud state. This is really only viable today for organizations that were incorporated after the cloud existed, right? And didn't have any IT before. Small companies can get here, of course, but the less stuff you have, the easier it is to move to this position. If you've got this, then basically you've not got a very interesting identity and access management project, because most of the work is already done, and IAM inside Azure is quite limited to the Microsoft products at the moment, and therefore there's not much to be done. That's kind of the whole point of trying to get here. So I understand this is quite high level, but that's actually pretty important. As I mentioned earlier, now this transformation journey that we're on isn't just the identity team's responsibility. There's definitely a significant overlap, particularly with Intune, particularly with Sentinel for security and operations management, and particularly with cloud. What's it called? Defender for Cloud, which is kind of Sentinel. It's kind of all muddled together. It's again less of a user and service identity consideration. It's much broader now, and that's how we can justify doing it in many ways. This is basically a high-level overview of how to get onto this sort of path. Obviously you need your Entra ID. And when I say that, I'm also kind of saying you need to be thinking about things like conditional access policy and having it in a solid, secure state before then obviously onboarding things into it. If you don't have a decent conditional access policy, it's very difficult to then have different requirements for different applications from a sign-in perspective. Say you want application A to require Microsoft Authenticator, but there's another application where you want to add an additional factor of authentication on top of that. If you want that kind of granularity, then you're going to be looking at conditional access policy. So again, another example, whereas if we're traditionally in the Active Directory space, and we're now an identity person who's sort of in the Entra box, we also need to understand that the Entra is a much broader capability than it was previously, and things that were things that we used to do in ADFS are now being done in our arena, as it were. Okay, so I've already spoken about the scenarios at a high level. This is just a rehash of that. I don't really should take that out and this. But I wanted to just briefly touch on a couple of scenarios with a bit more technical detail, because those diagrams that I showed earlier are a bit too fluffy for my liking. Now, the names were different before we updated the documentation, but this is our kind of middle ground hybridy one, where we've got a majority of things are mastered in Active Directory, but we've got a few other things in play and a single HR system. So we're not doing anything complex here, but the reality is actually quite complex in terms of footprint, right? We've got this Entra Connect, which is synchronizing AD with Entra, of course. And then we've got MIM, which is syncing other applications on premises with Entra and with Active Directory. And so in this scenario, the end goal is to try and remove MIM and reduce our dependency on Active Directory. Now, this also opens up opportunities. With this type of scenario, we can connect to HR systems on premises, or any application on premise we have a connector for, whether it's AD integrated or not. But we've also got the ability to talk out to HR systems, but using a legacy approach, right, ADFS or similar. Whereas if we do this well, we can actually leverage SAML authentication to software as a service in the interim, which is a good stepping stone. So that's what it looks like before we start, and this is kind of what it looks like in the new world. And you're thinking, well, hang on, Spence, there's not much difference there. Well, there actually is quite a lot of difference. If we go back, we've got nowhere near as many paths of data transmission and synchronization happening. In the new way, you'll notice, although it's not particularly clear, but we've actually got rid of Microsoft Identity Manager. So that's good news. That's 4 less machines and all the rest of it. We've also opened up a direct ability to integrate with software as a service, or indeed a custom application that's running in the cloud, which we weren't able to do before, or at least not easily. And if we want to, we could also leverage external identities. So I could invite somebody to collaborate with me, using their Gmail account, for example. Now, I'm not suggesting that's generally a sensible idea. You certainly won't want to let them log in with their Twitter ID, for example, but technically it's possible, right? So that's something that wasn't really possible before, and it is now. And we've also removed any custom connectors here. And then, this is a slide that just basically reiterates what I was saying. There is an important note here, actually. In this scenario, depending on how complicated we want to make it, we might be able to get away without Entra Connect and use Entra Sync instead. But again, it goes back to that table that we saw in the introductory material, whether that's possible or not. this is actually doable with P1, which is, you know, for small companies, that's quite a big deal, right? There's no additional cost here for doing this because the P1 is included in their Microsoft 365. On the other end of the scale, a complex scenario, same thing, but we have MIM managing Entra ID and other software as a service applications. We've probably got some business logic here. So if we add a new user to PeopleSoft, we need to have them go through some training video that explains to them how to use the keycard access entry system and who they need to report a security incident to. And it's only after they've completed that course that then they get, you know, their mailbox and their laptop and all the rest of it. There might also be significant challenge with conflicting information, right? So in one system, it might say that my manager is James, but in another system, it tells me it's Peter because I, you know, was on a secondment or something like that. These things are very common, depending on how efficient people are at updating the systems as things change. So again, from an architecture point of view, how it looks today actually is virtually identical to the first example. It's just that we're already dealing with probably some external identities, and we're already probably working with cloud hosted through some kind of custom component running in both locations on our on-prem infrastructure, but also in AWS or similar. And again, I've missed out a slide. My apologies. That is exactly the same slide, just slightly different sizing. I have missed out a picture from this slide deck. My apologies. I will update it and send it to Dennis and Ziggy after the call with the correct diagram. It is a very similar end state where we basically remove MIM and basically move all of that provisioning inside of Entra ID controls, but also we've obviously removed Entra Connect and are using Entra's Cloud Sync in its place. So the direction of the arrows change in terms of how they speak to the directory service, which is the only difference between this slide, right? We can still use MIM in this scenario as well, if we need to, you know, for helping with avoiding that kind of big bang and saying on, you know, September the 1st, we are no longer going to be doing it that way. We're going to be doing it this way, you know, because that can sit there and still do stuff as necessary. And if we find that we've made a mistake, we can revert back to it. But this is going to cost you a lot more money aside from the consultancy fees, because you're going to need more extensive Entra licenses, and you also need to consider, okay, if we're running lifecycle workflows or other provisioning logic in the code, you know, there's going to be a usage cost to that, depending on how we've chosen to do it. Which brings me to the last topic on tooling, right? If we are doing any kind of additional provisioning, logic, workflows, etc., we have the glorious situation where today we have so many choices about how we could implement them versus the old days when we were very restricted, right? If we deployed MIM, our provisioning kind of had to be in MIM and do it the MIM way. If we were using Empower ID, then we had to do it the Empower ID way. Whereas now we basically have, you know, the world is our oyster in some respects, and that can be a good thing and a bad thing, right? Because there's so many options for extensibility. This is just the Microsoft platform. You know, there's no technical reason we couldn't also start thinking about, well, we could do some of this on Amazon Web Services, right? Which opens up a whole nother, you know, pie diagram with lots of different ways of doing the same thing. So again, this is an example of where our job as an identity specialist or, you know, an IDM consultant is kind of expanding in scope. because this is obviously software development we're talking about. As a general statement, the provisioning API is a good start point for, pumping things into Entra. Logic apps, those kind of things, they're still viable. It's an interesting area because a lot of evangelists will sort of scoff at you if you suggest a slightly out of date approach to doing something. Because there's so many new things coming on board with Azure. And if you remember, it wasn't that long ago that Service Bus was going to solve all our problems for us, right? And Service Bus underpins products like Workflow Manager. Well, Workflow Manager no longer exists, right? Effectively, it's now completely unsupported. Service Bus is still in place. It's being used for things like for self-service password reset, for password write back. But nonetheless, that can be considered legacy already, right? And it's only been around for 10 years. So bear that in mind. You're probably going to have a conversation with a developer at some point. Depending on your point of view, that's either a good thing or a world of hurt. So in my mind, software is software, and it's our responsibility to understand both infrastructure and applications and how they're built, because that's the only way we can provide rational advice to customers. But we all know, the industry has made great attempts to separate us and say we've got IT pros here and we've got devs here and all the rest of it. At the end of the day, it's all software, and that's actually more true in cloud than it ever was in on-prem, where you could kind of get away with having that delineation between the two. Here's a simple example of using Azure Data Factory to do some upstream provisioning. Standard extract, transform, and load model. This works well. It doesn't cost that much, but it does cost, right? There's no capital cost, but there's a usage cost. So, that's something that needs to be factored in. You could do the same thing with a Logic app, no problem. Data Factory makes more sense conceptually for this type of solution, but it doesn't mean the other options are invalid. So to sort of finish off, I've got one more topic, and then we can you can stop listening to me and ask your questions. This is really about establishing target architecture in conjunction with hopefully some strategic IT direction in the customer. Understand our dependencies and blockers, because that's what allows us to say, okay, this is our hit list, the order we're going to do it in, and the benefits that it's going to realize. The improved documentation that I've referenced today, this is slightly out of date. I did update it before today's presentation to state that actually, for the first time, I'm able to say we actually did what we said we were going to do with the documentation, rather than being 6 months late. So the sun's out here in Edinburgh. It's still officially summer. We got this done. This has been up for quite a while, actually. By no means does that statement mean I'm saying we're finished with it. We absolutely aren't, right? You're going to read those pages and you say, oh, well, what about this? What about that? There's plenty more coming, but getting it started was a significant achievement from the Microsoft folk, and actually Microsoft Learn. They did us a solid, so it's worth mentioning it when it's a success instead of just criticizing. One other thing I want to touch on, which is a new feature relatively in the last few months, is called the group source of authority conversion. This has long been, like, every time I've given a presentation like this in the last 3 or 4 years, somebody has come up at the end and said, well, what about this? And that's legit, right? This is a major problem. Right? We can't minimize or get rid of our domain controllers and Active Directory if the source of authority for groups is still in Active Directory. It's also partly related to the reason why we can't get rid of that last Exchange server, right, in the organization, because of the schema and other related source of authority information that still exists in the on-prem directory. So now with this conversion of group SOA, which is important to understand at the moment is just for groups, we can, basically move the SOA from on-prem to Entra in the cloud, and then at that point we can delete the groups from Active Directory. We have been promised this for the future. I can't say anything more. What's the word? I can't be more precise about when that future might be. There's a lot of work that needs to be done here before they open this up and enable it. Think about it, if you're Microsoft and you're the guy whose responsibility is for saying, yes, that's ready to ship, and the damage that could happen if the choice was made too early. So that's why it took so long for Group SOA. It's a good thing that it's available. So here's a little diagram, again, taken from the announcement, or actually from the Learn documentation, where, if we do this, but we still need to support some legacy systems on-prem, we can still do the move of the SOA to the cloud, but then we sync it back to the on-prem. Okay, so we do group provisioning to AD on-prem, as well as have the source of authority in the cloud. So this is kind of the middle ground, gets us to where we want to be in the end state, but we've also still got our capability for our line of business system. When we get rid of that line of business system, or it becomes end of life or similar, then we can move to the ideal situation, which of course is that the security group no longer exists in AD. It doesn't need to be provisioned. It doesn't need to be synchronized. It's not there. And of course, the more of those we can remove, the closer we are to being able to remove that infrastructure on premises. So this was sort of announced and snuck out. There wasn't much of a fanfare because it's not sexy and it doesn't involve AI. But this was probably the single most important product announcement from Microsoft this year, in my opinion. If our end goal is to reduce the amount of Active Directory, then this is definitely the most important product announcement. So with that, I am finished. I just want to mention the conference happening in Cologne. I should really say Cologne, but sorry, I am English. There's nothing I can do about it. I didn't vote for Brexit. Anyway, this event happens every year. It's a community event. I think some of you will find it interesting, particularly the AI and Cloud Summit, which has quite a lot of focus on identity. I'd also like to encourage you, if you fancy it, to submit to speak. We are very much an event. I'm not involved directly in the organization, but I can kind of talk on their behalf here. We're very much community driven. We don't want to have it just be, a procession of people from the product team telling us the marketing stuff. If you've got a topic that you think would be useful for the community to hear, feel free to make a submission via the website, which is not on the slide. That's my fail. Nobody else's. www.collabsummit.eu is where to submit, and we'd love to see you there. It's in May, so the weather's pretty nice, and it'll be our first time in Cologne, so I'm looking forward to it. With that, thank you very much, and I guess I've gone a little bit over time. Apologies for that. That was always going to happen. Yeah, hopefully we can have a discussion, or I can attempt to give you the wrong answer to any questions you might have. Thanks again to Dennis and Ziggy. Really appreciate you asking me to do this.